A choir boy vanished from his church in 1981, and 22 years later, his robe was found sealed behind a wall where no child should ever have been. But before Marcus Williams became a mystery, he was simply a 12-year-old boy with a voice that could make grown men weep and a smile that lit up every Sunday morning at First Baptist Church of Millbrook. The sanctuary hummed with the familiar pre-service energy that June morning, sunlight streaming through stained glass windows and casting jeweled patterns across worn wooden pews. Marcus stood in the choir loft, his small hands gripping the rail as he watched the congregation file in below. His white choir robe hung perfectly pressed, the way his mama insisted, and his hair was combed into neat rows that still held the smell of pomade from that morning's careful grooming. "Marcus, you ready for your solo today?" Sister Dorothy whispered, adjusting the sheet music on the piano. Her fingers moved across the keys in a gentle warm-up, the notes floating through the sanctuary like promises. He nodded, though his stomach fluttered the way it always did before he sang alone. Marcus had been singing in the choir since he was 8, but the solo parts still made him nervous. Not because he couldn't hit the notes, Lord knew he could reach higher than boys twice his age, but because when he sang, people stopped what they were doing and listened. Really listened. Sometimes the older ladies in the front pew would dab their eyes with their handkerchiefs, and Deacon Johnson would nod his head like Marcus was delivering a message straight from heaven. The other choir members took their positions, robes rustling as they arranged themselves by height. Marcus found his spot in the front row, right where Sister Dorothy could see him clearly. Reverend Caldwell appeared in the doorway of his office, his tall frame casting a shadow across the choir loft as he surveyed the scene with those dark eyes that seemed to see everything. "Beautiful morning for worship," the Reverend said, his voice carrying that same authority it held from the pulpit. "Marcus, I trust you're prepared for today's special selection?" "Yes, sir, Reverend Caldwell." The sanctuary filled with the opening. Hymn, voices joining together in harmony that seemed to lift the very rafters. Marcus felt the familiar warmth spread through his chest as his voice blended with the others, creating something bigger than any of them could make alone. This was where he belonged, where his gift meant something. But in 20 minutes, his voice would fall silent forever, and no one would notice until it was too late. Evelyn Williams stood at her kitchen sink, washing the same plate for the 3rd time, while her eyes stayed fixed on the window that faced the street. The Sunday roast sat untouched on the dining room table, growing cold alongside the green beans and cornbread she'd prepared for Marcus's favorite meal. 6:30 had come and gone, then 7. Now the clock above the stove read 8:15, and her boy still wasn't home. She dried her hands on the dish towel, the fabric rough against her palms as she tried to steady the trembling in her fingers. Marcus was never late. Not once in his 12 years had he failed to come straight home after evening service, still humming hymns under his breath and eager to tell her about who'd been in church, what Reverend Caldwell had preached about, how his solo had gone. The phone rang sharp and sudden in the quiet house. Evelyn lunged for it, hope flooding her chest. "Hello? Evelyn? It's Sister Dorothy. Is Marcus feeling all right? He missed evening service." The words hit her like cold water. "What do you mean he missed it? He never came home from morning service." Silence stretched across the line. "Honey, Marcus left the church around noon, right after morning service ended. I saw him walk out the front door myself." Evelyn's grip tightened on the receiver. "That was 8 hours ago. Maybe he stopped somewhere with friends." "No?" The word came out harder than she intended. "Marcus doesn't just wander off. Something's wrong." She hung up and dialed the police, her fingers trembling as she spun the rotary dial. The desk sergeant who answered sounded bored, like he'd fielded 100 calls just like this one. "My son is missing," she said, forcing her voice to stay level. "He's 12 years old. He left church this morning and never came home." "How long has he been gone, Mum?" 8 hours. A pause. 8 hours isn't very long for a boy that age. They like to explore, you know. Probably found some friends to play with and lost track of time. You don't understand. Marcus doesn't do that. He's responsible. He comes home when he's supposed to." "I'm sure he does, ma'am, but kids will be kids. Give it until morning. If he's not back by then, we can file a report. I need someone to come out tonight." Another pause, longer this time. "Ma'am, We don't have the resources to chase down every kid who's running a little late. 9 times out of 10, they show up before bedtime with grass stains on their clothes and a story about catching frogs." The line went dead. Evelyn stared at the receiver, disbelief mixing with a growing fury that made her hands shake. She dialed again, got the same sergeant, made the same request. This time his voice carried an edge of irritation. Outside, Mrs. Henderson's porch light flickered on, casting long shadows across the empty street where Marcus should have been walking home. The sanctuary felt different on Wednesday evening, emptier somehow despite the usual prayer meeting crowd filling the wooden pews. Evelyn Williams sat in the 3rd row, the same spot where she'd watched Marcus sing his solo just 3 days ago, her hands folded tightly in her lap as she waited for service to end. She had questions that needed answers, and Reverend Caldwell had been avoiding her calls since Monday morning. When the final Amen echoed through the church, Evelyn rose and walked purposefully toward the front, where Reverend Caldwell stood shuffling his sermon notes. His tall frame seemed to stiffen as she approached, his dark eyes not quite meeting hers. "Reverend, I need to speak with you about Marcus." "Of course, Sister Williams. Tragic situation." He tucked his papers into his leather portfolio with deliberate slowness. "The whole congregation is praying for his safe return. I need to know exactly what happened Sunday morning, after service." Reverend Caldwell's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "As I told the police officer who called, Marcus left with everyone else when service ended. I didn't see anything unusual, but someone must have seen him after that. He was here for hours before he disappeared. Sister Williams, children come and go from this church all the time. We can't be expected to keep track of every what?" The words came out sharper than she intended, cutting through the polite veneer they'd both been maintaining. "Every child, or just mine?" The sanctuary had grown quiet around them. Sister Dorothy stood at the piano, her fingers frozen above the keys as she watched the exchange. Deacon Johnson paused his conversation with Mrs. Patterson, both turning their attention toward the tension building at the altar. "Now, Sister Williams, there's no need to get upset," Reverend Caldwell said, his voice taking on that patronizing tone she'd heard him use with difficult parishioners. "We're all doing everything we can." "Are you?" Evelyn stepped closer, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Because when I asked Sister Dorothy about Sunday, she couldn't remember seeing Marcus leave, said she was busy cleaning up after service. But you say you saw him go?" Reverend Caldwell's eyes flickered towards Sister Dorothy, a look passing between them that lasted only a second, but felt heavy with meaning. "Memory can be unreliable under stress." "My memory isn't unreliable. Marcus was supposed to help me serve. Dinner at the church fellowship next week. We talked about it Saturday night. He was excited about it. That boy doesn't just disappear." "Sister Williams," Reverend Caldwell's voice carried the full weight of his pulpit authority now, "I understand. You're grieving, but making accusations won't bring Marcus home." "I'm not making accusations, I'm asking questions. There's a difference." The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words. Around them, the congregation began to file out, conversations muted, eyes averted. They all felt it, the shift in the room, the way the familiar warmth of their church had turned cold and watchful. Sister Dorothy finally spoke, her voice barely audible. "Maybe we should all just pray harder." But prayer, Evelyn thought as she watched Reverend Caldwell disappear into his office without another word, wasn't going to tell her why everyone who claimed to love Marcus suddenly couldn't remember anything about his last day. The flyers felt rough between Evelyn's fingers as she stapled another one to the telephone pole outside Morrison's grocery store. Marcus's school photo smiled back at her from the white paper, that gap-toothed grin he'd been self-conscious about, his eyes bright with the kind of hope that belonged to children who still believed the world was mostly good. Missing, Marcus Williams, age 12. Last seen Sunday, June 14th at First Baptist Church. If you have any information, please call. It had been a week since the police finally agreed to file a report, and still no official search. Detective Morrison had driven by the house twice, asked the same questions both times, and left with a promise to keep looking into it that felt as empty as Marcus's bedroom. "We'll take the north side of town," said Mrs. Patterson, her weathered hands accepting a stack of flyers. She'd organized a group of women from 3 different churches, and they'd spent their Saturday morning walking door to door, asking questions the police hadn't bothered to ask. "Got plenty of tape and staples?" Evelyn nodded, watching the small group disperse across the parking lot. Not many volunteers, maybe 15 people total, but more than the city had provided. The Millbrook Gazette had run a small story buried on page 3, between the church social announcements, and a notice about the upcoming county fair. No photo, just 2 paragraphs that managed to mention twice that Marcus was troubled and came from a broken home. The broken part, Evelyn had told Mrs. Patterson after reading it, is that they think a 12-year-old boy only matters if he fits their idea of perfect. Down Main Street, she approached every shop owner, every clerk, every person willing to stop and look at the photo. Most shook their heads with genuine sympathy. A few avoided eye contact entirely. One man at the hardware store studied the flyer for a long moment before saying, "Cute kid. Hope you find him." But it was what he didn't say that stayed with her. The way his eyes shifted when she mentioned the church, the slight pause before he wished her luck. By afternoon, her feet ached, and her voice was hoarse from repeating the same story over and over. The volunteers regrouped at her house, comparing notes over coffee and determination that was slowly giving way to exhaustion. 23 businesses, reported Mr. Jenkins from down the street. Most said they'd keep an eye out. Few said they remembered seeing him around town, but nothing recent. "What about the arcade?" Evelyn asked. Marcus loved that place. Owner said he hadn't seen him in weeks, but Mrs. Patterson hesitated. He seemed nervous when I asked about it, kept looking toward the back room. Evelyn felt something cold settle in her stomach. In all the places they'd searched, all the questions they'd asked, one truth was becoming clear. People were afraid to talk, not because they didn't care about Marcus, but because they were protecting something or someone more than they wanted to help find a missing child. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across her empty street, and still no word from the boy who should have been home for dinner. The basement of First Baptist Church had always smelled like old hymnals and floor wax, but on this February morning in 1982, it reeked of fresh concrete and something else, something that made Tommy Fletcher's stomach turn as he descended the narrow stairs with his toolbox in hand. "What you need me to do down here, Reverend?" Tommy called over his shoulder. He'd been the church's maintenance man for 12 years, knew every creaky board and leaky pipe in the building, but he'd never been asked to work in the basement's back storage area before. Most folks avoided that section entirely. Too dark, too cramped, too far from the fellowship hall where normal church business happened. Reverend Caldwell appeared at the top of the stairs, his silhouette blocking most of the light from above. "Just some repair work, Tommy. Water damage behind the old Sunday school rooms. Need to seal it up properly before it spreads." Tommy squinted in the dim light, looking around the familiar space that suddenly felt different. The Sunday school. Tables had been moved, stacked against the far wall in a way that seemed deliberate rather than convenient. A section of the floor showed signs of recent work, new concrete patches that didn't quite match the original foundation, still damp, enough to leave footprints. "Reverend, I don't see no water damage down here. Floor's dry as a bone except for behind the wall, Tommy." Reverend Caldwell's voice carried that same authority it held from the pulpit, the kind that didn't invite questions. "Can't see it from here, but the moisture's been seeping through. Need you to seal up that back room completely. Board it up, concrete over it if you have to." Tommy walked toward the area the Reverend indicated, his work boots echoing hollowly on the concrete. There was indeed a small room back there, barely bigger than a closet, with a heavy wooden door that looked newer than anything else in the basement. The metal hinges gleamed with fresh oil. "What's been stored in here?" Tommy asked, reaching for the door handle. "Nothing important." The words came too quickly. "Just old files, broken furniture. Church board decided we need the space. Sealed off for safety reasons." Tommy's hand froze on the handle. In 12 years of maintaining this church, he'd never known the board to make decisions about basement storage. Most of them wouldn't even come down here during fellowship dinners, much less worry about what was behind unmarked doors. "Reverend, if there's water damage, shouldn't I take a look first? So make sure there's no mold, no structural, "The room stays sealed, Tommy." Reverend Caldwell's voice cut through the basement air like a blade. "Board's decision is final. You just need to make sure nobody can get in there again. Ever." Tommy looked up at the Reverend's face, trying to read the expression in the shadows. But all he could see were those dark eyes, watching him with an intensity that made the hair on his arms stand up. He picked up his hammer and a box of nails, the sound of metal on metal echoing through the basement as he began boarding up a door. He'd never been allowed to open, sealing away whatever the church needed to forget. By 1985, Evelyn Williams had learned to carry her grief like a stone in her chest, heavy, constant, but manageable if she didn't think about it too much. The two missing person flyers had long since faded from telephone poles and shop windows, replaced by newer tragedies and fresher hopes. Marcus's bedroom remained exactly as he'd left it, dust gathering on his comic books and science fair ribbon, but the rest of the house had slowly adapted to the silence of a child who would never come home. She still called the police station, every few months, always asking for Sergeant Morrison, who'd been promoted after Detective Henderson retired. The conversations followed the same script. Any new leads, any updates, any reason to believe Marcus was still out there somewhere. Morrison's answers grew shorter each time, his voice carrying the weary patience of a man who'd learned to manage expectations. "Mrs. Williams, I understand your frustration, but we've followed every lead, checked every tip. The case is officially inactive, but that doesn't mean we've forgotten." Inactive. The word tasted bitter. "My son isn't inactive, Sergeant. He's somewhere. Ma'am, it's been 4 years. If he were going to be found, we would have found something by now." She hung up before he could finish the thought, the same way she'd done a dozen times before. The unspoken words hung in her kitchen anyway. If Marcus were alive, someone would have seen him. Called, written, something. The church had stopped mentioning him in their prayers sometime around 1983. New families filled the pews, children who didn't remember the boy who used to sing solos that made grown women weep. Sister Dorothy still nodded when she saw Evelyn at the grocery store, but the conversations that once lasted 20 minutes now barely stretched past hello. Even Mrs. Patterson, who'd helped organize those first search efforts, had started avoiding. Eye contact at the post office. People moved on, life continued. The world forgot that Marcus Williams had ever existed, leaving only his mother to remember the sound of his voice echoing through the sanctuary on Sunday mornings. By 1988, Evelyn had started working double shifts at the textile factory, using exhaustion to chase away the dreams where Marcus called for her from places she couldn't reach. Her hands grew rough from the machinery, her back curved from long hours bent over sewing stations, but the physical pain was easier to bear than the other kind. In 1990, she received a letter from the district attorney's office informing her that Marcus's case would be transferred to the cold case files. Official closure, they called it. Administrative necessity. She held the letter for a long time, reading the bureaucratic language that reduced her son to a file number and a storage box in some basement archive. That night, she sat in Marcus's room and spoke to the empty space where he should have been, her voice barely above a whisper in the darkness. "They think you're just a number now, baby, but I know better. I know you're still out there, still waiting for somebody to find you." Outside, Millbrook settled into another ordinary night, a town that had learned to sleep peacefully, despite leaving one of its children behind. The sledgehammer felt good in Jake Thompson's hands as he stood in the basement of First Baptist Church, sizing up the renovation project that would either make his construction company's reputation or break it. 22 years in the business had taught him to read buildings like books. Every crack told a story. Every patch of mismatched concrete held secrets. But this basement felt different, heavy with the kind of silence that made experienced contractors uneasy. "We want to expand the fellowship hall," explained Deacon Mills, a thin man in his 60s who kept checking his watch like he had somewhere more important to be. "Knock out these back walls, create more space for church activities, youth, groups, community dinners, that sort of thing." Jake nodded, running his flashlight beam across the areas marked for demolition. The church board had been clear about their timeline. Work needed to be completed before the new pastor arrived in 6 weeks. Reverend Caldwell had passed away the previous winter, and the congregation was eager to start fresh with a modern facility that could attract younger families. "What about this section?" Jake pointed toward the boarded-up area in the far corner, where sheets of plywood were nailed over what looked like an old doorway. The wood was grey with age, the nails rusted but still firmly in place. "Blueprints don't show anything back there." Deacon Mills shifted uncomfortably. "Storage room. Been sealed up for years due to moisture problems. Board wants it opened up as part of the expansion." Jake approached the boarded section, his footsteps echoing hollowly on the concrete floor. Something about the space felt wrong. Not just the obvious fact that someone had gone to considerable trouble to seal it off, but the way the concrete around the boards looked newer than the rest of the foundation. Patches of different shades suggested multiple repair jobs over the decades. "When was this sealed up?" he asked, running his hand along the edge of the plywood. "Oh, early 80s, I think. Before my time on the board." Deacon Mills's voice carried a note of finality that suggested he didn't want to discuss it further. Jake's flashlight caught something else, scratches in the concrete near the base of the boards, like someone had tried to claw their way out from the other side. Or maybe it was just his imagination, the kind of paranoid thinking that came from working in too many old buildings with too many secrets. "You sure about opening this up?" "Sometimes it's better to let sleeping dogs lie." "Deacon." Mills stiffened. "The board has made its decision. We need the space." Jake shrugged and picked up his crowbar. In 22 years, he'd opened up plenty of sealed rooms. Most contained nothing more interesting than old files, broken furniture, or evidence of long-forgotten water damage. But as he positioned the tool against the first board and applied pressure, he couldn't shake the feeling that whatever lay behind this particular wall had been hidden, for reasons that had nothing to do with moisture. The first nail gave way with a screech of protest that echoed through the basement like a warning. The last board came away with a sound like breaking bones, and Jake Thompson stepped back as stale air rushed out of the hidden space, carrying with it the smell of concrete dust and something else, something that made his throat close up. He played his flashlight beam through the opening, revealing a room barely 6 feet square with walls that seemed to press inward like a fist. A single metal chair sat bolted to the floor in the center of the space, its legs anchored with concrete that looked much newer than the foundation around it. Scratches covered every surface within reach, desperate gouges in the concrete walls, fingernail marks that formed crude tallies and letters. In one corner, a small metal locker stood against the wall, its door hanging slightly ajar. Jake's hands shook as he stepped into the room, his work boots crunching on debris that looked like pieces of broken chalk, or maybe fingernails worn down to nothing. The scratches on the walls weren't random. They formed words, letters, desperate messages carved by someone with nothing but time and terror. "Help" appeared in crooked letters near the door. "Mama" was scratched repeatedly along one wall, growing smaller and fainter as it descended toward the floor. And in the corner where the shadows were deepest, barely visible unless you knew to look, "Marcus W." The flashlight beam trembled as Jake approached the locker. The metal door opened with a soft creak, revealing contents that had waited 22 years to be found. A white choir robe hung from a small hook, still pressed and clean despite the decades, as if someone had carefully preserved it as evidence of innocence destroyed. The fabric was small, sized for a child, with a small tear near the collar that looked like it had been made by struggling hands. Jake reached for his cell phone with fingers that wouldn't quite work properly, dialing 911 while his eyes stayed fixed on the robe that seemed to glow in the darkness of the hidden room. "I need police at First Baptist Church on Maple Street," he managed, his voice hoarse. I found something, a room. There's evidence of someone was kept here. A child." The operator asked questions he couldn't really hear over the sound of his own heartbeat. Jake backed out of the room, but he couldn't escape what he'd seen. The desperate messages, the chair bolted to hold someone who couldn't fight back, the robe that belonged to a boy who'd vanished during Sunday service 22 years ago. He thought about Deacon Mills's nervous fidgeting, the way church leadership had been so eager to expand this particular section of the basement. They'd known. Someone had always known what was hidden behind those boards, sealed away like a secret too terrible to acknowledge. In the darkness of the basement, Marcus Williams's choir robe hung in its metal tomb, waiting for someone to finally listen to the voice that had been silenced so long ago. The police sirens were already wailing in the distance. Detective Lisa Chen had worked enough cold cases to recognize the particular weight that settled in a room when long-buried secrets finally surfaced. She sat across from Evelyn Williams in the same interview room where Sergeant Morrison had once dismissed a mother's desperate pleas. But this time, the dynamic had shifted completely. The choir robe lay sealed in an evidence bag on the table. Between them, white fabric that had become proof of everything Evelyn had tried to tell them 22 years ago. "Mrs. Williams, I need you to look at this and tell me if you recognize it." Chen's voice was gentle but professional, the tone of someone who understood that evidence could wound as deeply as it could heal. Evelyn reached toward the bag with trembling fingers, then stopped just short of touching it. "That's his robe, the one he wore every Sunday. I ironed it myself that last morning, made sure the collar was perfect." Her voice broke slightly. "He was so proud to sing in the choir." Chen made careful notes, documenting not just the identification, but the way Evelyn's face crumpled with recognition, the way 22 years of wondering had culminated in this terrible confirmation. Outside, Millbrook was buzzing with news. So of the discovery. The local paper had run the story on the front page, and suddenly people who'd claimed to remember nothing about Marcus Williams were calling the police station with fragments of memory they'd kept buried for decades. "Mrs. Patterson is here to see you," Officer Rodriguez announced, poking his head through the door. Chen nodded, watching as Evelyn straightened her shoulders, preparing herself for whatever revelation was coming next. Mrs. Patterson looked older than her 73 years as she settled into the interview chair, her hands worrying the strap of her purse. She'd been one of the few who'd helped search for Marcus in those first desperate weeks, but Chen could see in her eyes the weight of something she'd carried alone for too long. "I should have spoken up back then," Mrs. Patterson began, her voice barely above a whisper. "But he was the Reverend, you understand. People didn't question men like Reverend Caldwell." "Not in 1981, Chen leaned forward. "What did you see, Mrs. Patterson?" "I was cleaning the fellowship hall after morning service, and I heard voices from the basement, raised voices, a man's voice and—" She paused, pressing her lips together. "And a child crying, begging to go home." Evelyn's sharp intake of breath filled the silence. "Why didn't you—" "Because I was scared," Mrs. Patterson said, finally meeting Evelyn's eyes. "And because when I asked Reverend Caldwell about it later, he told me I'd misheard, said it was just the radio from his office carrying through the vents. Made me feel foolish for even asking." Chen's pen moved steadily across her notepad. After 2 decades of silence, the dam was finally breaking. 3 more congregation members had already called to schedule interviews, each claiming they remembered something that might be important. The choir director, Sister Dorothy, had been found in a nursing home in the next county, her memory failing but still sharp enough to remember the day Marcus Williams stopped singing. "Mrs. Patterson, do you remember anything else? Any other times? You heard something unusual?" The older woman nodded slowly. "There were others, other children who seemed different after spending time with Reverend Caldwell. Quieter, more nervous around adults. The investigation that had been dormant for 22 years was finally awakening. And with it, the voices of those who'd been too afraid to speak." Sister Dorothy's hands shook as she poured tea from a china pot decorated with faded roses, the kind of delicate ceremony that belonged to a generation that believed proper manners could hold back the chaos of the world. At 81, she moved carefully through her small apartment at Millbrook Manor, her once strong fingers that had coaxed hymns from piano keys now gnarled with arthritis, and something deeper, the weight of secrets that had eaten at her for 22 years. Detective Chen sat on the floral sofa, watching the elderly woman's face for signs of the clarity that came and went like morning fog. The nursing staff had warned her that Sister Dorothy's memory was unreliable, but Chen had learned that trauma could preserve certain moments with startling precision while erasing others completely. "Are you a Marcus Williams's choir director?" Chen said gently, accepting the cup of tea she didn't want. "Do you remember him?" Sister Dorothy's eyes sharpened, focusing on something beyond the small living room. Beautiful voice, like an angel. She paused, her fingers drumming against the arm of her chair. He was so excited about his solo that Sunday, practiced it every day that week. What happened after the morning service? Do you remember seeing Marcus leave? The drumming stopped. Sister Dorothy's face went through a series of changes. Confusion, recognition, then something that looked like fear. I should have stopped him, should have said something when Reverend Caldwell called him down to the office. Chen's pulse quickened. Marcus was called to the office right after service. I was putting away sheet music when I heard the Reverend tell Marcus he needed to speak with him privately about his behavior during the service. Sister Dorothy's voice dropped to a whisper. But Marcus hadn't misbehaved. He'd been perfect. Did you see them go to the office? Sister Dorothy shook her head, her eyes growing distant again. I heard them on the stairs, going down to the basement instead of up to the office. I thought it was strange, but she trailed off, staring at her hands. We didn't question Reverend Caldwell back then. Nobody did. Chen leaned forward. Sister Dorothy, did you ever see Marcus after that? Did he come back upstairs? The silence stretched long enough that Chen wondered if the elderly woman had forgotten the question. Then Sister Dorothy spoke, her voice so quiet it was barely audible. I waited for him to come back for his music folder. He'd left it on the piano with his pencil stuck in the binding where he'd marked his solo. I kept waiting, but he never came back. Her eyes filled with tears. I threw the folder away after a few weeks. Couldn't stand looking at it anymore. Chen felt her chest tighten. Did you tell anyone what you'd seen? About Marcus going to the basement with Reverend Caldwell. Sister Dorothy's face crumpled. I tried to tell his mother when she came asking questions, but Reverend Caldwell said I was confused, said I was getting old and mixing up different days. Made me feel like I was losing my mind. But you weren't confused, were you? No, Sister Dorothy whispered. I knew exactly what I'd seen, but I was scared. Reverend Caldwell had power in that church, in this whole town. People who crossed him found themselves unwelcome. She reached for a tissue with trembling hands. I should have been braver, should have protected that boy. But I was a coward, and Marcus paid the price for my silence. The Millbrook Community Center had never held a crowd like this one. Television cameras lined the back wall, their bright lights casting harsh shadows across faces that had spent 22 years avoiding difficult questions. Detective Chen stood at the podium, a stack of evidence files before her, while Evelyn Williams sat in the front row with the same quiet dignity she'd maintained through decades of being dismissed and ignored. Based on our investigation, Chen began, her voice carrying clearly through the packed room, we have determined that Marcus Williams was unlawfully confined in a sealed room beneath First Baptist Church. Evidence suggests he was held there for an extended period before his death. The word death hit the room like a physical blow. Evelyn closed her eyes, finally hearing the confirmation she'd dreaded for over 2 decades. Around her, the murmur of shocked voices rose and fell like waves against a shore. The investigation has revealed a pattern of abuse perpetrated by Reverend Thomas Caldwell, who died in 1999. Multiple witnesses have now come forward describing inappropriate behavior and the systematic silencing of anyone who attempted to report concerns. In the third row, Mrs. Patterson wept openly. Sister Dorothy, brought from the nursing home in a wheelchair, stared at her hands folded in her lap. Deacon Mills, now in his 70s, had refused to attend, claiming illness, but his absence spoke louder than any testimony. The Church Board of 1981 has been subpoenaed to appear before a grand jury, investigating potential charges of accessory, after the fact, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. While Reverend Caldwell cannot be prosecuted, those who enabled the cover-up may still face accountability. Channel 7's reporter leaned forward. Detective Chen, what role did the original police investigation play in this cover-up? Chen's jaw tightened. The 1981 investigation was inadequate by any standard. Critical leads were not pursued, witnesses were not properly interviewed, and the victim's family was dismissed without cause. This represents a systemic failure that cost Marcus Williams his life. Evelyn rose slowly from her seat, and the room fell silent. When she spoke, her voice was steady, but carried the weight of every sleepless night, every unanswered phone call, every person who'd made her feel crazy for believing her son mattered. My boy was 12 years old. He loved to sing, loved to make people smile, loved to help me cook dinner on Sunday afternoons. He wasn't a runaway or a troubled child, or any of the things you called him to make yourselves feel better about not looking for him. She paused, her eyes sweeping across the faces of people who'd known her, known Marcus, known the truth and chosen silence. Marcus believed I would find him. He carved my name into that wall because he trusted me to never stop looking. It took 22 years, but he was right. I found him. The silence that followed was different from the polite quiet of church services or community meetings. It was the silence of a town finally confronting what it had allowed to happen to one of its children. Outside, more news vans were arriving, bringing with them the attention Millbrook had always avoided. The story was spreading beyond their small community, forcing them to face not just their past failures, but their future reckoning. The new sanctuary of First Baptist Church gleamed with fresh paint and modern fixtures, but today it felt heavy with the weight of memory and redemption. Sunlight streamed through stained glass windows that had been carefully preserved from the old building, casting the same jeweled patterns that had once danced across Marcus Williams's face when he stood in the choir loft, preparing to sing. Evelyn sat in the front pew, her hands folded around a program that bore her son's school photograph, that gap-toothed smile she'd carried in her heart for 22 years. The church was fuller than it had been since Easter, packed with people who'd come not just to remember Marcus, but to acknowledge their own silence and seek some form of forgiveness. Detective Chen sat 2 rows back, still officially assigned to the case that would never see a courtroom, but had already delivered its own form of justice. The grand jury had issued indictments against 3 former board members for obstruction of justice, though 2 were too elderly for prison sentences that would mean anything. The real punishment was this: having their complicity exposed, their reputations destroyed, their legacies forever tied to the boy they'd helped bury. At the piano, a young woman began playing Amazing Grace, the same hymn Marcus had been scheduled to sing as a solo on that last Sunday. The melody filled the sanctuary, and one by one voices joined in, tentative at first, then stronger, creating the kind of harmony Marcus had loved to be part of. Sister Dorothy, brought from the nursing home for the service, wept openly from her wheelchair. Mrs. Patterson sat beside her, both women who'd carried guilt for over 2 decades, finally able to speak Marcus's name without shame. They'd testified before the grand jury, their voices shaking but determined to tell the truth. They'd been too frightened to speak when it might have saved him. The new pastor, Reverend Jackson, was young and black and had accepted the position. Only after the church board agreed to establish a children's safety program in Marcus's name. He stood at the pulpit, where Thomas Caldwell had once wielded power like a weapon and spoke words that would have been unthinkable in 1981. Marcus. Williams was failed by every institution that should have protected him: his church, his community, his local police. We cannot bring him back, but we can promise that his voice will never be silenced again. Evelyn rose when invited to speak, her legs steady despite the magnitude of the moment. She looked out at faces that had once dismissed her, ignored her, made her feel invisible in her grief. "My son believed I would find him," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the sanctuary. He was locked in darkness, but he never stopped believing that someone who loved him would come. That faith, that's what I want you to remember about Marcus. Not how he died, but how he lived, how he trusted, how he sang. She paused, looking up at the empty choir loft where a 12-year-old boy had once stood, nervous but determined to share his gift with the world. His song isn't over. Every time we speak his name, every time we refuse to let a child's voice be silenced, Marcus is still singing. Outside, the autumn air carried the sound of children playing, their laughter mixing with the hymns that drifted from the sanctuary windows. A reminder that life continues, that healing is possible, and that sometimes the greatest victories come not from justice served, but from truth finally spoken.